You're listening to the Vint Podcast, where we bring you interviews and stories from around the world of wine and spirits. From winemakers and critics to sommeliers and master distillers, we'll explore the people and businesses who are instrumental in shaping the future of today's food and drinks culture. Enjoy the show. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Vint Podcast, a production of the Vint Marketplace, your source for premium wine and spirits at vintmarketplace.com. This episode is presented by Coravin. Coravin is the world leader in at-home wine preservation, allowing you to pour a glass of your favorite wine and enjoy more bottles in your cellar without having to pop the cork. And as always, I'm joined by Billy Galanko, who is going to share with us a little about how to enter to win a Coravin. This month, we're giving away another Coravin Timeless wine preservation system, and Billy's going to share about our new YouTube, reformatted YouTube, and how you can enter to win one of those devices.
Yep. So everybody knows we've been working on our YouTube. It's called Vint Wine TV. So to enter to win this Coravin Timeless, just go to YouTube, search Vint Wine TV, and then click the podcast section. All of our audios of all of our past episodes will be uploaded there. Just comment on the most recent episode, which will be this episode that you're listening to right now. Leave a comment, like the episode, and you'll be entered to win the Timeless.
Yeah, it's great to pick up. It would be great to pick up a new Coravin before the holidays, because having friends and family over, you might not be able to drink through all the wine that you want to pull out and share with people. Getting a Coravin in your hands before the holiday season will be, it's a great perk.
That's right. Coravin is the perfect companion for all of these holiday gatherings that are coming up when maybe you have relatives who are super picky and don't really all want to drink the same thing.
Yeah.
But before we get to this week's interview, though, I do want to touch on the news for this week. It is coming out of Napa Valley. There is a new AVA in Napa Valley. The first one since 2011, which is pretty exciting. I was thinking it might be like a new AVA completely, like maybe they're extending or going into new territory. But this AVA is it's called Crystal Springs, and it's actually on the lower part of Howell Mountain from 400 to 1,400 feet of elevation, which is interesting. So they basically took Howell Mountain and cut off a little bit of it. It's right above, below 400 feet is mostly Calistoga and St. Helena. So it's basically like they took a little bit of Howell Mountain. It's just above Calistoga and St. Helena to give people a sense of where we are in the valley. And yeah, it's new and people are really excited.
Yeah, and so Calistoga, and then basically this new AVA is the middle section of like Howell Mountain proper is going to be the high elevation stuff, and this new AVA is basically the middle ground between the base of the mountain and those upper elevations, correct?
Yep. And it's going to be on the northern end of the valley as opposed to closer to the San Pablo Bay.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. You said the first AVA, would you say since 2011?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I think most recently in the greater region, we had the West Sonoma Coast AVA. Was that we had talked about, I believe, last year. Is that the name of the AVA, West Sonoma Coast? Obviously not Napa, but...
Yeah. There's like a broader AVA with sub AVAs within. Yeah. So West Sonoma Coast, and we talked about that with the folks from Freeman Winery, which was really
good. It's just cool to see more differentiation, sub designations, these sub AVAs, greater AVAs, but then the sub AVAs popping up in that area of the country, so that there can just be more specificity about delineating between producers, styles of wine in that area, because it can be, I think for the average consumer, maybe thinking of California as a bit monolithic. And so I think any continued sort of chopping up of things maybe is good. Not sure, but maybe it's just more confusing.
No, I think anything, they have to prove that their wines are expressing a unique character of place. So I think it's always good. I think it's harder in Napa. I think Sonoma, there's many sub AVAs that are going to be popping up over the years because of just how varied not only the terroir, but the aspects and the impact from the ocean are there. But Napa, it's really interesting because they're really honing in and really kind of nitty gritty cutting into these little places and trying to figure out where the lines are of what's better, what's different, what's more unique. So I think it's really exciting.
And I wonder and I'm sure there's overlap between producers taking fruit from different parts of Howell Mountain, but I wonder if some of this was in the interest of producers who have plots up higher elevation on Howell Mountain, wanting to maybe draw a line of demarcation between, like there's a difference between our fruit at the higher elevation versus these lower. Or do you think it's not as, oh, we're better than you, sort of lobbying as that? What are the incentives, do you think?
I think it says it was driven by this guy, Stephen Burgess from Burgess Cellars, who's in the area since he's been trying to do it since 2006. Sounds like. So that was a while. But I think it's more to differentiate their wines from the Upper Howell Mountain stuff. I think to your point, there's a unique character when you get up higher in elevation. And I think they're like, we're not Calistoga and St. Helena. We're definitely up. We're cooler than the valley floor, but we're not quite maybe as light and closer to aromatic and that lighter style that you get on the top of the mountain compared to the middle. I think it's more the people in the middle. I think I will say though, arguing with Howell Mountain people, not arguing, but negotiating maybe to take away some of their AVA was probably tough. But I think once they had their arguments about the difference in the fruit and why they wanted to do it, I think they probably were able to get it through.
Yeah. Well, hopefully it's helpful for those producers to have more specificity of place and helpful for consumers too, just knowing exactly what they're getting over time. Very cool.
Yeah. All right. So getting to our interview today, we'll try to keep our introduction short because we had an excellent, great long conversation with Elizabeth Gabay and her son, Ben Bernheim. Elizabeth is a MW and a rosé expert. She stumbled into it after getting assigned to write about Provence rosés at one point in time for Decanter and fell in love with the category and basically realized how it was so disrespected amongst the wine cognoscenti. There's really high quality, ageable, complex rosés being made throughout the world. And she's made it her mission to really highlight those. And over time, her son started working with her and he's become a rosé expert in his own right. So now they've written multiple books on rosé and it was a really cool conversation. We covered the whole world. We dove in really deep in some areas. I thought it was fascinating.
Yeah. If the enthusiast journey for wine lovers has an end, it would be ageable rosés. I think that's sort of like if you had to map out the progression of what types of wines people seek out across their wine journey, ageable rosés, I think would be the pinnacle and the end of exploration. So it's really cool to hear folks who are passionate about something that, yeah, for a lot of enthusiasts, like I said, is like niche to totally unthinkable in terms of something that they consider when thinking about the wine world, ageable rosés. So yeah, for all of you who are based here in the US and have taken your journey through Napa and then Oregon, then to Bordeaux and feel like you've peaked at enjoying Grand Cru Burgundy, your next step is ageable rosé and rosé in general. They give us a great run through of where to find those wines.
Oh yeah. Yeah. And so Elizabeth's first book was called Rosé, Understanding the Pink Wine Revolution. And then she and Ben wrote Rosés of Southern France, which really digs in and shows you the nuances that it's not all just pale pink Provence rosé, which is really cool. And then they're actually working on another book also on Southern France that goes beyond rosé as well. So kind of like add some context to where those wines are in the grand scheme of Southern French wines. But it was a great conversation. They really played well off each other. You can tell they're always going to be traveling around trying to promote rosés in every corner of the world together. So it was a great interview.
Nice. Yeah. Well, before we get to that, remember, if you're looking to drink more wine from your cellar, even these ageable rosés, without worrying about wasting what you can't consume, grab one of the Coravin systems. It'll be your best friend. You can visit coravin.com and use code VINT15 for 15% off your purchase of any of their devices. And as always, members of the trade can go to trade.coravin.com for other discounts on the range of products and accessories for home and work. And remember, head over to our YouTube channel, leave a comment on this episode, and be entered to win a Coravin Timeless. Yeah, one of Billy and I's favorite devices. And certainly if you drink any volume of wine throughout the year, it's going to be something you want to have at your disposal. Now, without further ado, here is our interview with Elizabeth and Ben.
Hi, Elizabeth and Ben. Thanks so much for joining today.
Thank you very much for inviting us. Thanks for having us.
Yeah. So I heard you, Elizabeth, originally on another podcast, and I've actually gotten one of your guys' books. I've been meaning to dive into both of them, but it's been really cool to see your guys' approach to the subject matter, rosé in general, and we're really excited to kind of dive in. Before we go, you want to give us a little background on your life and wine, Elizabeth, and then we'll talk about how your son got into it as well?
I started like a lot of people as a student. You drink, So as a student, I was a member of Real Ale, Nice Wine, went camping round vineyards, drank wine, like many other people. But I do still have a tasting notebook from my camping round France. Wine notes, and there's a lot of wine notes that say good or bad, very, very explicit. And I never thought of working in wine. I worked in publishing, I worked in the theatre, I went backpacking, I visited vineyards in California, New Zealand, Australia, and I came back to London, and my parents had just bought a holiday home in Provence. I went to visit them, and there were all these lovely, this is mid-1980s, it was still very rural and rustic, and I came across these vineyards that wanted to sell their wine, so I loaded up my car and drove back to England, and then realised I actually didn't really know that much about wine. I remember going out for dinner, and my friend ordered a bottle of Chardonnay from South Africa. I said, Chardonnay? You can't have Chardonnay from South Africa. It's French. He said, it's a grape. You can get it from other countries. I was as much a novice as anyone else, and I do remember very clearly not knowing all of that. But London in the 1980s was very exciting for wine, very much the centre of the wine trade. I went to a wine tasting run by Stephen Spurrier after Judgment of Paris fame, and it was how bankers should learn how to order wine in a restaurant. So we were drinking top-end wine. And at the end, I said to him, I'd love to do the second course, but I can't afford it. And he said, would you like to pour wine for me? So Stephen Spurrier really got me going right back in the mid-80s.
Oh.
And then I just did all the courses, and I just kept on doing the next course, the next course, the next course. And then before I knew it, I was on the Masters of Wine course. And then he came along.
Awesome. That's fantastic. And it's so nice that I've always heard Stephen was a nice person, or always was trying to get other people into wine. That's nice that he was able to do that, and another version of that. So cool. So Ben, were you into wine coming out of the womb, or did it have to grow over time?
Lots of photos of me as a relatively young child with all sorts of wine. A lot of champagne, a lot of Provence, mostly those two categories.
No. So his first tasting...
And fortified.
He was 15 months old, and I was doing an MW practice tasting of fortified wine. And I saw the other students out at the front door. And when I got back in, I'm sure this is totally illegal, actually, he had finished all the fortified wine that was still on the table.
Put dregs in the glasses.
And he still loves it.
And then at university, I was very involved with the university's wine society. We tasted competitively. And then after university, I went off and did some seasonal work in various vineyards, and then ended up working as a sommelier in a hotel. And after that, came back and started working for Liz. That was 4 years ago now, just over 4 years ago now. So there was the odd gap when there was no wine, but on the whole, I've always been around it.
I think when Ben joined the Wine Society tasting team, and he said, "Oh, I've applied to join the competition team," and I said, "But you've never studied wine." Anyway, he got in and was the best white wine taster of the year. Obviously, yes, you did absorb it. Proud mummy moment.
I'm going to preempt your question, if I may. We work a lot with rosé today, and so much of the wine that we work with is pink, and it's anywhere between 2/3, 3/4. There are some weeks when it's every single wine we talk about or taste is rosé. And there's this assumption sometimes, and sometimes we forget it ourselves, that we have always worked in rosé, that we love rosé, that we look forward to the end of every workday to open a bottle of rosé. And maybe Liz will say more about it, but it's more by accident than anything else. And when we go back to Liz starting in the 80s, me starting 10, 15 years ago, the bulk of it was red and white, just as the rest of the world wasn't drinking rosé. Neither were we. And I wish that we could say that we were somehow visionaries ahead of our time but we fell into it by accident more than by passion for this undiscovered category.
Absolutely. You mentioned that we'd written a couple of books, and the first book was the publishers had approached me, and I said, well, can I write a book about Provence? And they said, oh, we'll come back to you. And 10 minutes later, they came back and they said, well, I'm not sure about Provence. What about Rosé? And I said, yeah, I can do that. Nothing to say, really, is there? I can do it in 6 months. And came downstairs to my husband and I said, oh, I've just been commissioned to write a book on Rosé. And his very first words were, you don't like Rosé. I said, be easy. And I was hooked, absolutely hooked. It was one of those accidents where you realize that even in the world of wine, where we have a lot of excitement and exploration, we are very blinkered to some categories. And even now, a lot of wine experts say to me, oh, aren't you bored with rosé? Can't you move on? Can't you do something else? And when we find a good rosé, it's, yeah. But it doesn't happen that often. Well, no, it does. It does. Yes. I lie. We do have some very exciting days where we just think we've struck gold.
I think that just as it's challenging to get consumers to be serious about pink wines or rosé wines, it can also, depending on what part of the world you're in, be challenging to find a producer who's serious about their rosé wine as well. And sometimes, especially here in the States, it turns out that they make a rosé because they had something left over, or because they know that they can fill some low price point in their portfolio. I think that probably the average, even wine enthusiast or connoisseur, has an expectation for rosé that there is this upper bound or a low upper bound of quality and complexity and intrigue that can be found with rosé wines. And there are some good rosés out there, but none of them are really that serious or that they could never reach the price points that some of these other maybe white wines of the world or red wines of the world reach. But certainly that's not true. And hoping to get some insight. My knowledge of those upper bounds of complex rosés are extremely limited as well. So yeah, hoping to hear, like, even outside of Provence, as you go across the world, who are the producers that, have come to the forefront early on for you when you started your discovery?
I think we felt very much the same. How do you discover good rosé? You can look on the internet, and we tried it. You key in all the words that you think will be the trigger to find a good rosé. And I would say 80% of the rosé that finds its way towards us, we're not terribly excited. So Ben devised a system when we did our last analysis of triggers that we could look for. We looked for things like dark bottles, old vines, indigenous yeast, all the things that you look for with red and white wine that are triggers that this is a producer who maybe is looking for something slightly different. And I think that has remained a very important way of, it doesn't necessarily guarantee that it's a good top rosé, but just to have those checklists that we can go through and pick things up. And dark glass actually remains a very, very easy way for the majority of people to home in on a good rosé. It means that they're not selling it by colour, they're looking at it as a wine.
You mentioned producers who maybe make an inexpensive rosé or who don't necessarily believe in it themselves. I think that's the opposite of that, or the other side of that statement, is one of the things that keeps us most invested in rosé. And there's a lot of categories or emerging categories of wine are driven by producers experimenting, producers that are bringing new products to the market, producers who are trying out new ways of expressing their grapes, their terroir, their winemaking techniques. And it's very much a supply side trend where it's producers are trying to make new wines. But rosé is actually the opposite of that. Rosé, rosé in the past few years is not producers rushing to make another rosé. They're making it because people are buying it. And it's a consumer or a demand-driven trend where we speak to producers all the time. And when they do bring a new rosé to market, they don't say, oh, we've been dreaming of this for 20 years of a way of making this. They say, we made this product because our importer in Denmark asked for it, or because we sold out every year and consumers were begging us for more. And that's what's really exciting about rosé, is that it feels it's a very dynamic category that people are actually looking for. Whereas there are, I think, a lot of categories in wine that are maybe they're harder sells, or maybe they're less fashionable isn't the word, but they're less flavor of the month. Whereas rosé is so exciting because it's what people actually want to drink. And we can't really, I mean, maybe I'm sort of jumping ahead here. We can't really pinpoint a producer who sat down and said, this is our plan to somehow change the world and sell more rosé. It's people just drank more and more rosé of their own accord. And that's what makes rosé so exciting. It doesn't feel like they're forcing it upon consumers, or that supermarkets are somehow having to discount massively to get their shelves with a rosé. People are actively looking. That's really, really exciting for us.
Actually, it's interesting because in June we did a trade day in London we showed 80 rosés from one at Tibet, 2,500 meters, to big names, to old vintages, to all sorts of different categories. And what was fascinating was that I think everyone who came found a rosé they loved, and it wasn't all the same rosé. And they came away actually surprised that when they sat down at lunch to talk about which were their favorite rosés, they didn't all agree. And that was a big shock, I think. These were top buyers and writers in London. They were very surprised that they didn't all go for the same rosé. It was kind of like, you didn't like that one? That one's amazing. And that actually vindicated for us that this still very haphazard way of finding the good rosé.
Yeah, I think that just goes as a testament to the range of flavors. I still, for my friends just getting into wine, I had that same conversation even about white wine, which is hard to believe. But adding a little bit of context, something I found really interesting in the intro to your book, I want to make sure I get the full title right here. It was Rosé, Understanding the Pink Revolution. And it's something that I had heard from other sommeliers. We had Andre Houston Mack on, who was like, back in the early 2000s, I identified this rosé and it was like a Somme secret, because only Somms were really drinking rosés at that time. Can you give a little context into just how recent the popularity of rosé as a category is, kind of on this scale? And then maybe we can talk about some other styles, like how it's made and how it's evolved over time, maybe from Vin Gris. But
you can do the making. I'll do the history bit. Yeah.
Yeah. Before we talk about rosé, I'll just say a quick word about the book. So Rosé, Understanding the Pink Wine Revolution was Elizabeth's first book that was published in 2018. And we wrote a subsequent book,
an e-guide,
a subsequent book, Rosés of Southern France, which was just on the south of France. It's published in 2022.
Yeah.
Perfect.
I think I had, like everyone else, focused on the very recent trend for rosé being fashionable. What's interesting is that rosé, claret, dark rosé, light red have basically been fashionable since ancient times, but it goes in and out. So in the 19th century, the big thing was big, deep, dark, tannic red wines. How big can you make your Bordeaux and how long will it age? And rosé became the dregs, the leftover fashion. And then actually a very, very significant part in the history of rosé evolution was Prohibition in America, because Grenache made wonderful fortified wine. It also makes great Provence and Tavel rosé. So that was the sort of the link between the American market and what was in Provence. And then the American GIs coming to Europe, the wine they knew was rosé. So it developed. And so there was this sort of up and down, in fashion, not in fashion. And then early 1990s, they discovered in Provence that if you make rosé with temperature control and very delicate pressing, you can actually make a very elegant wine. And I still remember being on trade stands in the late 1980s, early 90s, going, this pale rosé is not real rosé, is it? Real rosé is that rather coarse, rustic rosé that we all know. But it just swept the market. So I would say really from 1995 in Europe, 1995 to 2003 was a slow development
of modern rosé.
Modern rosé. 2003, we had a heat wave across Europe. Rosé was the in thing. By 2010, worldwide, everyone suddenly has discovered that this is possible. So it's a really, really short, recent phenomenon, this idea of pale rosé.
Yeah. It's a bit more nuanced, of course, than just saying 2010, everything exploded. There's certainly a lot of producers, as Liz was saying, in the 90s or the mid-2000s or 2010, 2012 maybe, when rosé really experienced a bit of a speed up. I think in 2012 was Miraval's first vintage, wasn't it?
Yes.
And people talking about Brad Pitt and his rosé.
2006 with Garris, with the most expensive rosé. Brad Pitt 2012.
And 2012 is really not that long ago at all. And when we think about, we'll talk a bit later about, say, Clos du Temple, which is one of the world's most expensive rosés, that the first vintage was 2018. So we're really not talking about 10 or 20 or 30 years.
Which makes it very difficult to do vertical tastings to say, if the sign of quality wine is, does the wine age? A lot of these wines haven't been made for so long, so we don't know if they age.
So,
like Star Trek, isn't it? We're going towards the final frontier. What can we explore? How's it made?
No, as I was going to say, the original book, Rosé Understanding the Pink Wine Revolution, it was a fantastic book when it was published. But we do caution people about, against taking it too seriously today, simply because the world of rosé, we're 2 revolutions later, almost, relative to that book. I think that's quite dangerous.
Yeah, I think I for some reason the published dates maybe on Amazon were backwards. So I for some reason thought it looked like the Rosé Understanding one was more recent, even though I've heard you talk about it before the date that it said it was published. So that's great. I'm happy to clarify that. Can you actually, before we move on to more details about how rosé is made, can you talk about what your latest book is about more and kind of what you're diving into? And I guess this will go into how Provençal wine is made and evolved, but maybe give us some insight into that.
And yeah, so when January 2020, the General Annual Commission of can you do a vintage report of all these different rosés, Ben came back, COVID came, and I've got 200 bottles of rosé in my living room. And we tasted. And then Ben, bless him, had the bright idea, we're not going anywhere. Let's just ask people to send rosé. So we had 1,000 rosés from across southern France. Pallet loads arrived. And we sat here in wonderful isolation, tasting through 1,000 rosés of southern France, and we did an e-guide because nobody could get to the vineyards. And we found that we were asking each other a lot of questions. Why, if they're all from southern France, why is that one so different to that one? They look as though they've got the same grapes, the same winemaking, but very, very different. And we kept on asking questions. Why are all the rosés from that little area got this taste or that taste? And so the Rosés of Southern France was born, which came out in 2022, which we self-published, looking at terroir, at grapes, at the rules and regulations for every little region, the history, the traditions. And I think for me, I don't know about for you, my biggest thrill is we did a tasting of rosés from the Southern Rhone. So all across the Southern Rhone. So we spent 2 whole days tasting, and we were able to say which village the rosés came from. And that was kind of like, yeah, we've cracked it. I'm not sure we could still now do it, but we were very focused. And there were a couple of rosés even now when I've tasted blind, I go, I know exactly where that's from. It's got that character. And that is what we were trying to do to try and stop people just buying Provence-style rosé is to actually understand the nuances.
Yeah, Provence style is an umbrella more than it is a style. There's dozens of categories within Provence style. And what does Provence style actually mean? And just staying on what Liz said with the Southern Rhone, for us, it was a big discovery. But we were also talking about how rosé is a relatively modern 5, 10, 15-year invention or discovery or phenomenon. We forget that of the 6 appellations that were first created in France in 1936, everyone talks about Châteauneuf. They forget Tavel, the other Rhone appellation also created, was rosé.
100%.
And 100% rosé. Rosé is as old as appellations are in France, sort of thing. Rosé is a historic category. And so Rosés of Southern France, the second book, was looking not just about the growth of the category as a whole throughout the whole world, but very much the microscope for Rosé's heartland, the south of France, different nuances of the south of France. We live in the south of France. I grew up here. It's very obvious to me that if you cross some river, that everything's a bit different, or maybe the landscapes feel different. Outside of the south of France, those differences really are far, far more blurred. And it's difficult to understand the geography of the area from halfway across the world, let alone how that geography is going to influence the wines. And the region hasn't been studied from a rosé perspective ever. And even generally, even from a reds and a whites perspective, people haven't looked at Provence in the same way they've looked at Burgundy or Bordeaux. And people haven't really compared Provence with the Southern Rhone or the Languedoc. And Provence is the famous rosé producer of France. Provence makes a lot less rosé than the Languedoc. And it's all still relatively similar in style. It's still Grenache. It's still Grenache Syrah or Grenache Syrah Sanso. It's all the same grape varieties. They're made in roughly the same way from roughly the same Mediterranean terroir. But they are, of course, very, very different. And so for us, the book was about looking at all those different subregions and saying, superficially, they're all Grenache-based, direct press, pale rosés with a Mediterranean climate. But when you actually look at them closely, even if in California that they may seem to be one category of south of France, really there's a huge diversity and a real richness.
For writing the book, we were driving around the southern France. So I'm the driver, Ben's the navigator. And we ended up going... We don't have a cross-country car. We did an awful lot of cross-country driving with Ben going, this looks interesting. And I remember being in Gigondas and Ben said, the best rosé in Gigondas, I think, is going to be up this road. It was very pretty. And we did discover some amazing little vineyards, little single parcels. But I think... Now I think maybe I wish I was a more poetic writer and I could have conveyed some of those stunningly beautiful vineyards where we found some really lovely rosés.
There is a lot of poetry to the south of France, whether it's Peter Mayle in his book A Year in Provence, or the image of maybe the coast and Saint-Tropez and lavender fields and olive groves, that there is a lot of poetry.
And Tuscany. We were in Tuscany last week and we were in Umbria and Tuscany doing rosé, and it was this, wow, same grape, different side of the hill, totally different, nearer the sea, higher up. Yeah.
But so much of that poetry or capturing that poetry in a book is what sells rosé. I think more so than maybe other wine categories. People talk about lifestyle, and there's this idea of rosé lifestyle. It's the beach, it's Saint-Tropez, it's the Côte d'Azur, the French Riviera. And one of the things we wanted to talk about in the book is that even if rosé is associated with lifestyle, even if it's lifestyle that's selling that rosé, even within the south of France, there's all sorts of different lifestyles, all sorts of different poems or poetic descriptions. And there's room in the south of France for Saint-Tropez. There's a lot of fantastic rosé made in Saint-Tropez. But there's also a lot of fantastic rosé made up hills with olive groves and goats and small windy roads in medieval villages. And so for us, the book was about capturing that and showing the diversity. And lavender fields. I come back to lavender fields. It's one of our pet peeves, because everyone uses it to talk about Provence. but there's actually very, very few areas in Provence where lavender fields coexist with vines.
And you don't make rosé from lavender.
And you don't make rosé from lavender. But anyway, we're not, if we're talking a bit about Provence, it's actually because our latest book that isn't yet published, but, and won't be when this podcast is released, is on the wines of Provence specifically. We're going even narrower, even more.
Red, white, and rosé, which we're quite looking forward to, doing the reds and whites as well. And the producers, as soon as you are you allowed to say this? The producers are so excited by the reds and whites.
So we were talking about, do producers believe in it? Is there a glass ceiling for rosé? Right. Even in the heartland of Provence, where everything is rosé, rosé is the money. It's 94% of production. It really, really is a huge phenomenon. The producers themselves, even here, care more about their reds than they do about their rosés.
I was going to say, so we went, I guess it's been almost a year and a half now since we drove through, and we went through season. Lavender was not blooming. We went specifically for the beauty, walking around. Also, I went for the wine. We tasted all throughout, whites and reds as well. And I was actually blown away. It's not something you hear a lot about. And I knew down by Bandol, Cassis, you were going to get some good stuff, but it was the quality all throughout. Well, we'll be very looking forward to that book. We actually had Tony Parker, the basketball player, on for a short podcast as well, talking about Le Mascaron. And he actually went on and on a little bit about the whites and reds as well. So it's definitely a thing. Speaking of, you mentioned Tuscany, and I think I want to bring it back a little bit to maybe give our listeners a quick overview of the styles of rosé between light and dark. I know there's a lot of, I live in LA near a lot of natural wine bars, and the line between a chilled red and something like a Chiaroscuro is tough to walk for some of these places. So it'd be interesting to see what the styles of rosé are, if you could explain that, and then maybe how they're made and why maybe the color comes out in a different way, grapes, etc.
Something we believe very strongly in is that the line between a chilled red and a Chiaroscuro, or chilled red and a dark rosé, does not exist. There is no line. We're not talking about hard categories. We're talking about a spectrum of color. And it's not necessarily just a color. It's such a rich world. We talk about red grapes and white grapes as if there's nothing in the middle. There are darker red grapes and there are grey grapes and there are slightly pinkish grapes. And when we talk about red and white, it's as if suddenly a third category changes everything. But really it doesn't. We've got orange wine, which may be more or less orange. We talk about blanc de noir, which is ultimately not that different from a very, very pale rosé. We have all of these lines that are really, really blurred. We have some rosés that are not that dark, but that are macerated for longer than a light red. So when we started off in rosé, we tried to come up with definitions for where is that line between a dark rosé and a light red. And every time we find a rule that we're happy with, we find a wine that breaks all those rules and stops it.
So the nearest we've got to a definition of rosé is it does not finish fermentation on the skin.
But we'll come up with plenty of exceptions. Ultimately, rosé is made just as red grapes tend to make red wine with red winemaking, and white grapes make white wine with white winemaking. If you mix the two and somehow use red grapes with white winemaking, you end up with a rosé. So ultimately, rosé is made by taking red grapes and not extracting too much of the color from the skins, and instead relying on the relatively colorless juice. In a nutshell, that's the simplest way of saying it. Rosé, to get that pale color, you limit the contact with the skins as much as possible. You take grapes, you pick the grapes, and you put them straight in the press, and you squeeze, and you get the juice, and that's
free run juice.
Free run juice. You put the grapes in the press, you squeeze, you get the juice, and that juice is very, very pale. If the grapes are very light, you'll end up with a blanc de noir. If they're very, very dark, you'll still end up with quite a dark rosé. The traditional way of making rosé, really we're talking the mid-20th century. People talk about it now, we're talking about it right now, but it's not really a relevant technique on any scale anymore. It's one or two producers. It was known as Senier or Salasso or Sangrado. It's almost never used today. And it was used to make stronger reds by separating the solids from the reds with the juice. the juice you'd make as a rosé, and the solids would be more concentrated. With climate change and modern winemaking, you don't really want that anymore. And that was very, very common. And Saignée still has a really bad reputation because it was a byproduct. There's a third category that is often lumped with Saignée or Salasso rosé, and that's maceration rosé. And that's rosé that is made in some contact with the skins, with the pips, for a prolonged period of time, but intentionally. It's picked with the intention of making a rosé. And that's sometimes known as méthode tavelloise. It's not really 100% exactly the same. It's certainly not the same as Saignée. And even if superficially you end up with a rosé that's darker, you end up with a different set of tannins, a different set of flavor, different alcohol levels. Just to recap, you have direct press, which is relatively pale. You have Saignée, which is a byproduct of red and isn't really used anymore. And you have maceration, which is more or less dark and is more similar to a light red.
That's all easy, isn't it? Then you get to Spain. Navarra rosé is all Saignée. You're not allowed to make direct press. And in Rioja, we had some rosés which were 80% white.
But people talk about red and white grapes. There's this myth that rosé isn't allowed to be made from red and white grapes, or that it once was, and that
red and white wine.
Or red and white wine. People talk about rosé as from red grapes. In practice, rosé has always been made from a mix of red and white grapes and still is made from a mix of red and white grapes in a lot of traditional regions today. In Provence, it's more or less complicated, but it's more or less allowed to be 50-50 at most for any given wine, which is it's uncommon, but it is theoretically allowed in a few niche situations. In other parts of France, such as Tavel, a rosé can be 99.9% white grapes if you really want it to be. In Rioja, I don't believe there is even a rule as to what the maximum percentage is. So it really is very, very flexible.
And I think that like the very dull techniques. But I think one thing we've particularly liked is producers that are using more white grapes. They have greater freedom to macerate a bit longer without ruining the colour. And so you then start getting rosés that texture is quite good. That's got a bit of depth. Oh, that's got a bit more body. It looks like a Provence rosé, possibly smells like a Provence rosé, but on the palate, it's sort of like...
It might be more like an orange wine.
Yes, and that's exciting.
We talk a lot about still rosé, because that's what a lot of people think of as rosé, but there's also so many other subcategories. Sparkling rosés is of course a big one, and fortified rosé. Sparkling rosé, I think, is relevant right now because pink champagne is a huge phenomenon, especially in the United States. And there's I think one of the more exciting sparkling pink champagnes. I'm not going to name names right now, but the winemaker is very clear that in his mind, the best grape to make a rosé is Chardonnay, which it sounds incredibly counterintuitive. They believe that for that particular champagne house, that they want their champagne to be rich. They want it to have autolysis and brioche. They also want their rosé to have red fruit. But for them, the best way of getting that red fruit and brioche autolysis is to use a lot of Chardonnay. And so their rosé is from the Côte des Blancs, and it's 80% Chardonnay. It doesn't mean it's any less rosé than something that's made from Grenache or Syrah, and it doesn't mean that it's any less worthy of the title.
Who's that?
Miraval.
Oh, yes. Okay. Yep.
It's a really
This is my memory stick. Ben has to help me. I am likely to walk up to a producer and about to say, I love your wine. And he's, wrong winemaker, mummy. Wrong winemaker. Move along. So this is my memory. It's the joy of youth.
Yes. So to go back to your original question, where is the line drawn? There is no line. We have wines that are utterly indistinguishable, and we'll talk to a producer and they'll say, well, this isn't a rosé, it's actually a clarete or a chiaretto or a claret. And we'll say, why call it something when ultimately it's the same as a wine that someone else is calling something?
You nearly got thrown off a wine stand at a trade fair because you said it was a rosé and they nearly threw him off.
So I mentioned fortified rosé, which is a category that we really love. Big fan of fortified wine from the age of 15 months. Fortified rosé is a category. Pink port is an increasingly common thing. There's several Vin Naturel in the south of France, Baume de Venise or Muscat de Baume de Venise, Rasteau, and in fact, there's only 2 appellations in the southern Rhone that make a majority of rosé. And most people get the first one, Tavel. And if I were to ask you what the second appellation that makes more than 50% rosé is, would you be able to tell me?
Oh, now it's like a trick question. I want to say it's almost like Chateauneuf or something. No, I would not.
It's Rasteau, the Vin Naturel, the fortified wine of Rasteau. Ombre. But they're not allowed to put rosé on the label. So when they pick the grapes, they make the wine, they have to fill out the customs declaration to say they've made the wine and picked the grapes. And the box that they tick on their customs declaration form is that they're making a rosé. And so in official statistics, it's something like 55% rosé as an appellation. But on the label, when it comes to being bottled, unless it's bottled within the first year of being made, they can't put rosé on the label. They have to call it ombre, amber. And so if you walk into a shop and you see a bottle of Rasteau ombre, it may not look Provence pale or Tavel red or whatever, but it is ultimately made in the same way as a rosé is made, and it legally is a rosé.
But they nearly threw you off the stand.
But they don't like calling it a rosé, and it's this perception that if a wine has aged, then it's good, or is good, then it suddenly is no longer a rosé. So I mentioned champagne. Is direct press better or worse than maceration? Is color an indicator of quality? In champagne, they make blanc de noir, which is more or less a rosé. It's direct press black grapes. And somehow there's no color at all. And somehow it's a really qualitative wine. So we can't say that more color equals more flavor, because that isn't true in champagne. And we can't say that red grapes or white grapes are good or bad, because it's a complete mess.
So I have to say, my daughter doesn't drink, doesn't like wine, doesn't like alcohol. And when the two of us get excited about, have you discovered this wine? It's something slightly different. And we get told off, don't we? Can you stop talking about it? We're no longer interested. Move on.
One of our greatest, most exciting discoveries last year was a Greek producer called Troupis. And we tasted their rosé, and the packaging is beautiful. And tasting it, and it's made from Moscofilero, which is a pink grey grape, very musky, very floral, a bit like Muscat. And the rosé looks Provence pink. It's very pale, it's very pretty, it's very pink. And in the glass, it smells very floral, it's pretty, it's fruity. And on the palate, beautiful acidity and very, very
orange wine
tannins. Very, very structural, very, very tannic, very full body. And the wine is called Ekato because it's aged on the skins for 100 days, which even by the standard of a red wine is quite a long maceration. And because this grape is such a pale pink, it still results in a pale Provence style color. And so if you have your wine in the glass, it looks like a pink wine. It smells like a pink wine because of those floral musky notes. It has the acidity and the freshness and the excitement of the rosé. But is it a rosé? So it finishes fermentation on the skins, and it is arguably more of an orange wine. It's certainly not a red wine.
What is it? So it's very interesting though, because when we showed it at the trade day, it was one of those you love or hate it. There were people who loved that rebelliousness or thought stretching or completely rogue ideas. And then there were other people who just couldn't get their brain around it. Yeah, and it didn't matter what we said. And maybe I think that's what we've liked about rosé. It allows us to be slightly outrageous and challenging. And you can say, yeah, we're going to serve some rosé. And it's not what people expect.
I should say Liz and I are fortunate that we're not sure if it's genetics or just habit, but we do usually like the same wines. We work together, but we also appreciate the same things. we have a very similar way of tasting, fortunately a relatively similar outlook on the rosé world, which is very helpful. So we trust each other to taste a wine, or she trusts me more than I trust her. No, I don't need to trust you. But we trust each other to taste independently.
Oh, it's that look across the crowded room when you're in a tasting, and I can see Ben looking at me either going, come over here now, this is amazing, or just don't bother. Just stay where you are, this is not worth it. So I think we've developed quite a good sign language for, is this a good wine or not? Or we were talking to a winemaker the other day, fantastic rosé, love the rosé. And at the end, we both came away saying they have no idea what they're doing. They've arrived at a beautiful wine by accident.
But we're very good at asking the questions that we know the other one was thinking of, or certainly maybe not quite finishing each other's sentences.
No, we'd never do that, would we? No.
I want to get you guys to linger a little bit more on the ageability of some of these rosés. I think maybe one that comes to mind most readily from a top producer who's been making it for a long time is Chateau Moussard, whose rosé is famously ageable, and they have enough vintages to prove that. But maybe from your guys' perspective, and certainly with having tasted so broadly across Provence, you have a different perspective and can pull out some names for our listeners beyond that, which is admittedly maybe an obvious answer.
So I think the biggest guide for tasting aged rosés is thinking of Rioja, where they have Gran Reserva, Reserva, Crianza, and the current vintage for Gran Reserva Rosé is 2012. And it is tasting absolutely fantastically.
Well, so taking a step back, so you mentioned Chateau Moussard as an example. What I think is interesting with aged rosé is people have one or two examples in mind of this is a unique rosé that ages well. And actually, Moussard is not one we've heard before. Usually it's Tondogna or Tempier, or sometimes it's Tavel collectively.
So for the second book, we went back to 1976 in Tavel, 1990 Mazda Cabernet. And the biggest thing, it wasn't that those rosés were unique in that they can age. The biggest thing is, do producers keep enough old bottles for you to taste them to see if they age? I think generally the wines that age most are maceration, have some more maceration, bean and oak. I think your average light Provence rosé is not one that will age. It's not meant to be. Where else did we have Tavel, Bandol, Rioja?
So people are always giving these examples of wines, but I think what Liz is saying is that there's actually, it's not just 2, 3, or 4 estates that are famous for that. There's actually a vast range of wines that age really, really well, of rosés that are made to age or can age. So Liz was talking about 2012. People always talk about Rioja. They talk about Tondogna. They don't talk about Rioja as a wider category for ageable rosés.
But I think one thing that's interesting, we're talking about aged rosé, and I think you'll agree. A lot of people say it doesn't age because it doesn't taste how it tasted when it was young, which is silly because white and red doesn't taste the same. And it's been able to understand the style evolves and adapts, no? Color changes, the fruit profile changes, more dried fruit, more nuts, maybe a bit more floral for some of them. A bit more floral notes.
Are they the same components? What makes a white wine age or what makes a red wine age, whether it be the acid and the tannin? I'm thinking a little bit of Emilio Pepe's Chirasuolo. I know some people age some of those a little bit. Do Chirasuolos, because they have more like anthocyanins or tannins? Or maybe not tannins, but anthocyanins at least?
Tannins. So not all Chirasuolo has good tannin. But yes, alcohol, sugar, sweet wines will age well. Rosé d'Anjou, Cabernet d'Anjou, the Rasteau, acidity.
In a nutshell, yes, it is the same as reds and whites, that every characteristic of a red or a white that will help it age more or less applies to rosés. There are some bits that are slightly different, some characteristics that may be more or less important in our experience, but ultimately it's exactly the same. If you take a red wine and you age it very, very briefly in stainless steel, put it in bottle to emphasize the fruit, and you come back to it 10 years later, of course it's dead, same for a rosé. And a rosé that's had a lot of time maturing in oak, for example, will be like a red, more likely to age. Not a guarantee, but more like. And going back to what I was saying about Rioja and Reserva, Gran Reserva, there are these categories in Rioja as an example, and they do have similar but not identical standards to the reds. So you cannot label a Rioja Gran Reserva rosé as a Gran Reserva unless it has spent time in oak, because they believe that there are similar requirements.
But actually, oaks, though, is a particular bugbear, because a lot of producers think, if I put my rosé in oak, I will make a good rosé. And the amount of oak rosés we've had, and we've gone wrong oak.
Yeah. So your question, is it tannins? Is it sugar? Is it acidity? Is it alcohol? All relevant. And there's no shortcuts. There's no shortcuts to magically making an ageable rosé. Color is sometimes, as Liz said, maceration, but the tannins are really important. And going back to different grape varieties and different colors, you can't make a dark rosé and somehow expect it to age better than a pale rosé unless you have the tannins, unless you have the alcohol, unless you have the acidity.
The structure of the weight.
A lot of people think that rosé is an inherently lighter wine than reds or whites. That's not necessarily the case. I would be surprised to find an ageable rosé that's under 14% alcohol, for example. People see it as being, it's pale, it might be 11.5, it might be 12, it might be 12.5. I would be surprised to see that wine age, certainly in the south of France or Spain or Italy, similarly to how I would be surprised to find an 11% red that ages.
Oh, yeah, I think that's something that very much we're noticing, just as you get big-bodied red and these light reds you mentioned at the beginning for summer drinking. I think it's very important it's very important to remember that there is more than one rosé style. So there will always be the happy swimming pool, fluffy pink wines. They will always exist. But there are also that complex sommelier-driven, wine bar-driven rosé, which I think is the style we go for. We don't have a swimming pool. That's not our everyday drinking. Ben's a mountaineer, and he takes quite complex rosés up in his rucksack and tastes them 2,000 meters, 6,000 feet. And
yeah, it's a really, really wide range. And I think it's easy to see one or two producers and think they're unique, but really it's a wide range of rosés, some of which might be very pale and some of which might be more oaky, some of which might be darker. And I think we were really shocked to discover just how widely ageable rosé is.
And it's such a region, is it? It's producer. You can't say one appellation. We could never say, go to this one appellation and you can guarantee you will get ageable rosé.
No. So we would never say, go to Bandol or go to Tavel. We would say, go to this particular producer and understand what it is that they're doing differently. That being said, there are hotspots. As Liz was saying, Rioja, it's not a unique characteristic there to find maybe 15, 20 producers who all make a really, really ageable rosé. As Liz said, some of them, the current vintage is 2012. Risi in Champagne, which is still rosé made in Champagne. That's another example of one where there's this concentration of producers that on the whole make an ageable rosé. But other than maybe those and even then, not every Rioja will age well.
And not every Tabel.
Not every Tabel. Most Tabels.
Well, that's an interesting point. The
same as for reds and whites. It's the winemaking that matters. But there are a sufficient number of producers who make an ageable wine that I really wouldn't be worried about finding one if you were looking. That being said, the ageable rosés, most producers will make a range of rosés, and 80-90% of their range won't be ageable. It's their standard benchmark rosé. 95% of all wine of any color is drunk within 12 months or 18 months of being made. It's the same for rosé, just might be 98%.
Yeah.
But the real problem, if you're we're speaking to an American audience, is the ageable rosés don't leave France. And if they do, they don't leave Europe. The German market is quite keen on, but a lot of the time we'll speak to a producer and we'll say, we only make 1,500 bottles of this ageable rosé, and it gets snapped up instantly by that friend, that restaurant, or that strange buyer in Berlin who takes all of it. And it never really goes much further. So it's very rare to find it in the US. Even in London, it's not so common. And especially in even further markets, China. So I think even if it does exist, it's a very situational thing. We see a lot of it, but it doesn't really,
Yeah. But we get to economics then, and that's a whole nother ball game.
That makes sense. Yeah. We sell through our marketplace. We do see some like Tondonia demand and Tempier demand for sure. And then around here, actually, I have seen some Musar rosés fairly, not regularly, but out there. Before we wrap up here, I wanted to ask, you mentioned a couple earlier of these really expensive rosés that are quote unquote the most expensive. Can you talk a little bit about those and like maybe why they're charging so much for them? Because it sounds like the old school why wines are so expensive are like they're going to age for years if you look at First Gross or, DRC or something. Are these more marketing gimmicks in your opinion? I don't want you to offend anyone if you don't want to answer, but yeah, what is the deal with these?
Do you want to talk about Fine Rosé Day, and I'll talk about some of those rosés? When Sacha Lachine first made Garros, so it was released, the 2006 vintage was released in 2007, and it was sold for $80. And everyone just laughed. We all laughed. Nobody buys, this is a glass ceiling. No one's going to buy a rosé at $80. And he sold out the first year, and he sells out every year. You cannot get older vintages. And he marketed his rosé in that it was made in the same way as a Burgundian white wine. It's 50% white grapes, it's fermented in barrels, temperature control, did everything that he would do for a white wine. And he understood that there is a certain market that will always want the most expensive. And in this case, it was the yacht owners from the south of France who wanted the most expensive rosé. And that lasted for quite some time. And then the Sine Qua Non that has rosés for $2,000. I've never tasted it. I've just read about it. And then in 2018, Gérard Bertrand released Clos de Tom, which is basically a very small vineyard, old vines, made with barrel, amphora. And I was there at the launch and everyone was going, $200, €200 for a rosé. You're absolutely mad. And he said, I make a red wine in Clos d'Or for the same price. I put exactly the same amount of work into the rosé and the red. And I'm making this wine to age. So he put to one side 2,000 bottles of every vintage so that he can do vertical tastings. And we've done vertical tastings of the wine since 2018, and they are aging. The potential for their aging is magnificent. And what the reason he did it, I'm sure a lot of it was marketing, but the idea was that if you make a rosé well, why shouldn't you charge that higher price?
Not necessarily more than the red, but as much. Although I will say people talk about the most expensive rosés in the world, Clos du Temple, Garros.
And that Cherasuino.
There's a Cherasuino at €80 from Valentine.
Yeah, Valentine.
The most expensive rosés in the world are probably not those. They're probably the champagnes. Whether it's, I'm thinking of Krug or Dom Perignon or Roederer Crystal, all make a rosé. And the rosé is more expensive than the equivalent white in almost every single case. Nobody questions that because it has bubbles and it's from Champagne. So I think the question is not, are these rosés worth it? It's maybe more, is any wine worth $200-300 a bottle? Would I pay? People often ask us, would we buy them? And I say, no.
We're wine writers. We can't afford that sort of thing. Yeah.
But I'm not sure I'd buy a red at that price either. In June 2024, Liz and I organized a tasting in London specifically of all of the world's most exciting, most expensive rosés. We called it the Fine Rosé Day. We wanted to talk about rosé as a fine wine and we had about 80 wines all lined up that were all aiming to be age-worthy. We asked that people bring at least 3 vintages of every wine. Wasn't always possible for logistical reasons. Almost every wine there was, I think, certainly over $40 or $50. But we were also keen to have exciting wines, regardless of the price tag, that were all age-worthy, that all had a reason to not just be a supermarket rosé. And they all stood up. I think they all stood up to the challenge. And
nobody actually came out of that tasting saying that was too expensive. And I think that's quite an interesting point, in that whether it's clothes or cars or wine, if it's something that you feel is good. And so just actually go back to Stephen Spurrier when we were judging at Decanter, and he would say, if you're between a silver and a gold medal, the question you have to ask yourself is, what more can that wine do? And if you can't,
Awesome.
if it ticks all the boxes, if it gives you joy, if it provokes an appetite, if it makes you think, if it is typical of its place, what more can that wine actually do? So why should you just pay $5 for it? Why shouldn't you value that wine? And I think that is the most important thing for us. If that wine is doing everything it should be doing, why should it be penalized just because it's pink?
Yeah. Oh, I love that. And I think that's a perfect place to leave this on. Thank you guys so much for your time and all the insights. It's been amazing.
I hope we didn't talk too much.
Oh, no. It's been
if I can also say just go back to one of the last questions. Liz and I make a rosé in Slovakia. It's a few thousand bottles. It's tiny production. And I think it's relevant to 2 of your questions today. One, what is the difference between a light red and a rosé? We're very keen for this rosé to not say rosé or the word rosé anywhere on the label. We make the best wine we can. We're very transparent about how we make it, and we leave it up to the consumer to decide whether it's a red or a rosé. So it is in practice a rosé. It's about 18 to 24 hours maceration. It's very, very fresh. It's very, very elegant. But in terms of color and packaging, it looks more like an elegant Pinot Noir. It's a very light red. And you probably could chill it. I think it would be a shame, but you could chill it and drink it as a red. Or you can chill it and drink it as a rosé, or you can serve it at room temperature, and it's somewhere between the two. And we don't call it a rosé anywhere. And in Germany, our German importer sells it as a red wine. They're very happy calling it a red. They sell it as a red. For them, it sells better. It fits what they're looking for in a red better than for a rosé. In Britain, it's sold as a rosé. So it really depends. And there is no rule one way or the other.
I can send you a photo of the label, because the label is very, very clearly not saying it's a rosé. And the current vintage is?
The current vintage is 2020.
Oh, wow. Cool.
So we're really not afraid to say that once we put everything in it, we have the acidity, we have malolactic fermentation, we have tannins, we have oxidative winemaking, we have a dark glass bottle, which is something Liz mentioned. It's really important. We've done everything we can to make it age well. Why does it matter that it's a rosé?
Awesome. Well, I hope we'll be able to find some, and our listeners can find some. That sounds amazing. But thanks again for your time, guys.
Thanks a lot.
All right. That was our interview with Elizabeth Gabay and Ben Bernheim. I hope everybody learned a ton about rosé. Definitely want to go check out those books. I'm partway through the Rosé Understanding the Wine Revolution one. It's been amazing so far. And if you want to drink more rosé, like Brady was saying, maybe it's a young one, maybe it's an old one, you should get a Coravin Timeless. Don't forget to comment on the Vint YouTube to be entered to win a Coravin Timeless. And that is our episode for this week. We'll be back with another episode next week. Cheers.